Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today is, after long last, our 100 subscriber special. So I've been looking forward to this for a while, and I positioned everything so it's, you see my beautiful gladiolas behind us. That's what I grew them for. Nice backdrop, aren't they lovely? Anyway, I got 20 minutes to cover 20 books from 20 centuries. So what I think is the most significant book, in my opinion, or to me, for each century. So that's where the 100 comes in. So what's the best book or most significant book to me, or the one I respect the most in a given century? Now, sometimes, a few times the choices were easy, a few times they were really hard, and nevertheless, I'm glad that I was able to work something out here, and I think there'll be something of interest to everyone. So I've got 20 minutes to cover 20 books, and I've already used 1 minute, so we'll go a little bit quicker. So the first book, so we're dealing with the first century AD, so from the year 0 to 99, I guess. And I chose the Gospel of Matthew. So obviously the New Testament is hugely beautiful, significant works of literature, and the reason why I chose the Gospel of Matthew is because it has the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, and it's my favorite of the Gospels. It's I think in a way the most significant in the modern world, although one could argue that the Gospel of Luke, with its focus on the poor, is also pretty darn significant today. My least favorite gospel is the Gospel of John, because it's sort of Gnostic nonsense, whereas the Gospel of Matthew is a beautiful work of morality, of ethics, and so that's my first choice. Now, my second choice you might not have heard about, so not my second choice, but for the second century, so from the year 100 to the year 199, I chose the Shepherd of Hermes. I don't know if you've heard about this particular book. This was one of the works that almost made it into the New Testament. Now, it would have been kind of a strange, held a strange position in the New Testament, because I think it would be much longer than most of the other, I'm pretty sure, than any of the other old New Testament books. And the Shepherd of Hermes is basically a very beautiful work by this person called the Shepherd, who basically talks about his mystical experiences, the revelations that God has given him. And again, it was extremely influential in the early church, and apparently almost made it into the New Testament. So you should probably check that work out. It's not that long, but it's long for, when you're comparing it to the Gospels and so on. So for the 3rd century, all right, I'm almost caught up here in terms of the time-wise. I chose Platinus's Aeneids. So if you know me at all, I love Plato. I love Platinus. Platinus was the first. He's what started the what they would call the Neoplatonic school of thought. So there was the first Platonists, so the early Platonists. The middle Platonists were basically Stoics, and then the Neoplatonists were followers basically of Plotinus. So Plotinus's Aeneids is very long, and it is the source of a lot of Christian inspiration towards things like the doctrine of the Trinity. So Plotinus divided God up into these 3 things as well, and which the ideas come from Plato, but Plotinus really built them up. Okay, number 4. So for the 4th century, the Life of Anthony by Athanasius. So the 300s were the beginning of Christian theology in a real public sense. So there were Christian theologians like Origen and Tertullian in the 3rd century, but in the 4th century it enters into mainstream and becomes focuses of controversy, of politics and all that stuff. And one of the leaders of 4th century theology was the Bishop of of Alexandria, Athanasius, the famous Athanasius. And he's most important for his articulations of that Jesus is God against the Arian heresy that said that, no, the best Jesus could be would be like the best creation of God. Okay, so that would be Arianism. But I chose the life of Saint Anthony, Saint Anthony of Egypt. He was one of the first hermits or monks or whatever you would call him, and Athanasius's account of his life is beautiful. It was extremely influential on all subsequent lives of the saints. Is extremely influential on Saint Augustine, and that leads us into the 5th century. And I think it's pretty obvious, I choose Augustine's Confessions. I've talked a little bit about Augustine's Confessions here, not enough, and we'll talk more and more about it. This was the first great autobiography in history, and a limitlessly valuable source of beautiful religious thought and beautiful writing as well. So, going on to the 6th century, and I'm finally caught up with the timeline here, so I'm in the 6th minute. I chose a book that I've talked about here, that I did a review of, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. Now, this is one of those works that I liked more and more each time I read it, because I saw more and more to it, and I saw that it is a really well put together book, really well structured, and carries forth philosophical concepts in a very logical manner. And it's beautifully written, and again, endlessly influential. All right, we're starting to get into some difficult territory, because we're entering in what they would call the Dark Ages, where not as much was written. After the fall of the Roman Empire, literature became, the world was in chaos. Vikings, Germans, all those things, tribes, and the downfall of the Roman Empire, chaos, okay? So you're not going to get a lot of good literature out of that kind of timeline. So I chose, this was, yes, difficult and not difficult. I chose the Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus. Now, Climacus means ladder. So St. John of the Ladder is the guy who wrote the ladder, okay? The Ladder of Divine Ascent. It is probably the most important book in Eastern Orthodox spirituality, so Eastern Christian Orthodox spirituality, and it's one of those books. Well, it would play the role or take the place of, for instance, Saint Thomas of Kempis's Imitation of Christ. It's just like that epitome of spirituality. So, Western Catholic or Latin spirituality is the Imitation of Christ, and Eastern Orthodox spirituality is the Ladder of Divine Ascent. And it's a wonderful, ingenious work, and it's one of those works. He didn't invent this strategy. Evagrius Ponticus from the 4th century or 5th century, I think, and even Augustine, they wrote works that had ideas where you have to accomplish one virtue before you can reach the other, before you can reach the other, before you can reach the other. And that's the structure of the Ladder of Divine Ascent. Wonderful, powerful. Okay, so the 8th century, this was not a difficult choice for me. I chose St. John Damascene, or St. John of Damascus. His work, it's called The Fountain of Knowledge, but generally you know it by the title The Exposition of the Orthodox Faith. But the Exposition of the Orthodox Faith is only a third of the full book called The Fountain of Knowledge. It also has, the first part is called The Philosophical Chapters, and the next part is called On the Heresies, and the third part is the Exposition of Orthodox Theology. It's a masterful work coming out of it. I would call it, maybe St. Augustine's City of God is the first book of systematic theology, or maybe it's The Fountain of Knowledge by St. John Damascene. Now, St. John Damascene was in Damascus, and if you remember, by then that's in Muslim territory, and he was able to write freely against heresies and different things about Christian theology because he was basically protected by the Muslims. It's funny enough. Okay, the most difficult choice was the 9th century. This is the beginning of the Carolingian Renaissance, but the Carolingian Renaissance was just basically making Greek and Latin texts available. There was very little original productions, and this was the hardest century for me to choose a book, and so I finally fastened on Einhard's Life of Charlemagne. Okay, I know it doesn't stand equivalent with the other books I've chosen so far. I could have fudged things a little and said Beowulf was earlier or whatever, but I wanted to be sort of honest here. And so we don't know exactly when Beowulf, which I chose for our 10th century book, was written, and it probably wasn't written first. It was probably an oral legend and then written down later. It's an Anglo-Saxon work, but one that's set in either Scandinavia or Denmark or someplace like that. So Beowulf, the story of the hero Beowulf and his fight against Grendel and all these monsters and stuff, which is a very powerful work, one of the first and most important Anglo-Saxon or early English works. 11th century was not difficult. St. Anselm, by far your most significant writer, and I didn't choose his best known works, the Monologion and the Proslogion, which are basically about proofs for God's existence, rational proofs for God's existence. I chose the work that I thought was more interesting and has influenced me more, and that was his Cur Deus Homo, which is the Latin title, which means why did God become man? And it's basically a meditation on Christology. Okay, 12th century wasn't difficult either. I chose Peter Lombard's Sentences. Peter Lombard's Sentences was the book of theology, the textbook of theology for the next couple hundred years. It was the authority to Aquinas and Bonaventure and Duns Scotus and all these people, until Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica replaced it. And it didn't really replace it until about the 15th or 16th century as the textbook. So, and that leads us into the 13th century, which I chose, not difficult choice to make, St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, Sum of Theology, and I did a review on one small section of that work in a video, so check that out if you like. St. Thomas Aquinas still, today, is the most authoritative source of Catholic theology. I do believe I saw in the latest, in the 1991 or 2 catechism, that Augustine is quoted a few more times than St. Thomas Aquinas is, but I think the Summa Theologica is the #1 quoted work in the modern catechism. The 14th century, of course, brings us to Dante, and you probably think that I would choose the Divine Comedy, but knowing me, of course, you know that my favorite of his works is La Vita Nova, which I've reviewed, which means On the New Life or The New Life. And I prefer it, I suppose, as a source because it's a very passionate, self-revelatory work. And it's just so, to me, it's so beautiful and accessible and rich. Basically, it tells the story of Dante's love for Beatrice, and in which Dante explains his poems and how he writes poems and why his poems are written the way they are and so on. It's just so wonderful. Okay, we're making good time now. So 15th century, so the 1400s, I chose Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So obviously, as time goes by, more and more literature is being written, preserved, and known. So I chose Chaucer's Canterbury Tales because it is the original English. We would call Chaucer's English Middle English. It was the most influential source of English literature until Shakespeare comes along. And the Canterbury Tales is funny, it's interesting, it's informative, it's everything. It's really just a perfect, wonderful poem, or series of poems, I suppose. I was really glad to be able to separate that the next 2 works were actually written in separate centuries, and I didn't have to cancel out one for sake of the other, because they were written close together. They just happened to be, luckily, written on both sides of the century divide. So for the 1500s, I chose Saint Teresa of Avila's autobiography. Next to Don Quixote, it is the most famous, most significant piece of Spanish literature. So Saint Teresa of Avila's autobiography is amazing in terms of spirituality, self-revelation, influence, and the importance of Saint Teresa of Avila to modern Catholic spirituality, that we call it Carmelite spirituality, along with her friend and associate, Saint John of the Cross. To me, there was no doubt that of all the amazing works of what you call Catholic counter-Reformation literature, that Saint Teresa's autobiography would be the best, the best amongst her many works, and Saint John of the Cross's many beautiful, wonderful works. And don't forget, it's this century of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, Saint Francis Xavier, just giants of Catholic spirituality. And I just indicated my winner for the 17th century is Don Quixote. I've talked about it almost ad nauseum here on this channel. Don Quixote, like, for instance, Consolation Philosophy and Confessions, is just one of those works that keeps giving the more you read it. Don Quixote is hilarious. It's emotional. It's dramatic. It's tragic. It is a perfect work of literature. They call it the first novel, and what a great way to start. And I think Don Quixote probably has never been equaled subsequently. Maybe. And I'm happy to be able to say, amongst all the great works of the 1700s or the 18th century, I chose Robinson Crusoe. Not only was it one of the first novels in the English language, it has been one of the most influential. It is a fun read. It's so enjoyable and so interesting. And what a revelation of humanity, psychology, and religion. Okay, so I chose that amongst, and the 18th century is when the great novels start to be written in English, right? And hands down, to me, it's Robinson Crusoe. So, knowing me, you know what I'm going to choose for the 19th century. I chose War and Peace. This, of course, is this is the century of the novel. The 19th century is the century of the novel, and I think it's okay to say War and Peace takes the cake. I love Anna Karenina, Brothers Karamazov. They're way up there too. But I think it's safe enough to say that War and Peace is the most perfect. It is it will be ranked alongside all the works I've mentioned here as one of the gifts of human civilization. So, you know, in the 50 subscriber special, I devoted it to War and Peace. Now, 1900s was sort of difficult, but not really that difficult. The two authors that jumped to the fore for me were Kafka and Solzhenitsyn, and I chose Kafka. I chose Kafka for the simple reason that he evokes the modern spirit, touches my soul in a way that not even Solzhenitsyn could. And I didn't choose one of his 3 novels. I chose his short stories, and it's okay. That's not cheat. I didn't cheat, because in 1912 he published a work of his short stories called Contemplation, which was 18 of his short stories. Or in 1995, his complete stories was published. So if you don't allow me to pick that one, the complete stories, as the greatest book of the 20th century, then I will say that his 1912 18 short stories called Contemplation are the winner. And the reason is, these are just spectacular little stories. They evoke the modern spirit so perfectly, so insightful, so touching, so modern. And Kafka is without equal. I made our 20 minutes by a few seconds. Thanks, guys. Please like and subscribe so we can do a 200 subscriber special soon. Thank you all.